Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. My name is Dr. Caleb Rhinehart, and I'm recording this from coordinates that exist between the spaces where mathematics breaks down. Outside my viewport, I can see Earth burning in 13 different spectrums of light, surrounded by moons that never orbited our world, and asteroids that spell out my childhood address in languages I learned before I was born. The gravity here tastes like copper pennies and playground fears, and when I breathe, the air whispers the names of every person I've ever failed to save. I need to tell you about Eilith Prime, about what we thought we discovered in the deep places beneath its skin. Because in exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes, when this transmission reaches the outer colonies, you'll start receiving reports that will convince you humanity has made first contact with an alien civilization. You'll mobilize fleets, convene emergency sessions, prepare for either war or diplomatic breakthrough. You'll be catastrophically wrong on both counts. We didn't discover them. They've been growing us like fruit on a tree they planted before our ancestors crawled from primordial soup, waiting with the patience of geological time for us to ripen into exactly the right flavor of desperate. 6 months ago, I was Dr. Caleb Rhinehart, xenobiologist aboard the deep space research vessel Daedalus. The title sounds impressive until you understand that xenobiologist translates to professional disappointment when every world you survey turns out to be as dead as a politician's promise. My assignment to the Daedalus wasn't career advancement. It was exile wrapped in scientific terminology and tied with bureaucratic ribbon. 3 years earlier, I'd overseen atmospheric processing systems on Kepler 442b when a cascade failure turned 73 colonists into flash-frozen corpses in 17 minutes and 32 seconds. I know the exact time frame because I watched it happen through security monitors, helpless as my calculations proved inadequate against the universe's casual cruelty. The corporate inquiry cleared me of criminal negligence, but guilt doesn't recognize legal distinctions. They transferred me to the darkest edge of explored space, where my failure could embarrass only cosmic background radiation. The Daedalus was a floating monument to discontinued dreams, originally designed as a colony transport. She'd been retrofitted with survey equipment held together by engineering spite and maintenance prayers. Her corridors hummed with the particular frequency of machinery, one component failure away from turning everyone aboard into expanding clouds of frozen organic matter. The ship smelled like recycled air, broken ambitions, and the metallic aftertaste of cosmic radiation exposure. But it was quiet out there, cataloguing dead signals from dead worlds, and quiet was exactly what my shattered nerves required. Captain Ilana Durrell had been commanding deep space missions since before interstellar travel became commercially viable. Her face carried the accumulated weight of solar winds and cosmic radiation, etched with lines that mapped decades of staring into the infinite void. Her eyes held the particular emptiness that comes from spending so much time in space that you forget which direction leads home. She ran the Daedalus with military precision, despite never having served in any official capacity, because space teaches its own harsh discipline to anyone who wants to keep breathing. Durrell had joined deep space exploration after losing her family in the Mumbai atmospheric collapse of 2387. Her husband and 2 daughters had been attending a climate conference when the city's environmental shields failed, turning 3 million people into organic sculptures in superheated air. She'd been off-world when it happened, returning to find a memorial plaque where her house used to stand. Some people process grief through therapy or substance abuse. Durrell chose the endless dark between stars, where the only thing that could hurt her was the universe itself. Parvel Grozny was our chief engineer, a technical savant who spoke to machines in languages they understood better than human speech. His quarters resembled a shrine to mechanical prayer. Components arranged in patterns that served no function except to comfort their creator's obsessive need for order. Parvel could resurrect dead systems with a touch, coax life from circuitry that had given up hope, make broken things function through sheer force of empathetic understanding. But Parvel carried his own ghosts. He'd been born on Titan Station during the Methane Wars, when corporate conflicts turned Saturn's largest moon into a battlefield disguised as an industrial accident. His parents had been maintenance engineers who died keeping life support systems operational, while mercenaries fought in the corridors above their heads. Parvel learned early that machines were more reliable than people, more honest in their failures, more grateful for repair. He'd been having nightmares since we entered orbit around Eilith Prime, dreams of being disassembled by invisible hands that understood exactly how human consciousness was supposed to function. Naomi Wells completed our survey team, though calling her simply a xenolinguist understates her particular genius. She specialized in dead languages, the kind of academic pursuit that seemed pointless until you needed someone to decode inscriptions left by civilizations that had been extinct longer than humans had possessed written language. Her cabin overflowed with texts in scripts that predated conventional writing, dictionaries for languages that had never been spoken aloud, grammatical studies of dialects that evolution had forgotten. There was something unsettling about Naomi that none of us could articulate. She would carry on conversations with empty air, in languages that made your back teeth ache, speaking with the fluency of someone recalling childhood lullabies rather than academic study. Her dreams, when she shared them, involved memories of places that had never existed, conversations with people who belonged to no known species, and always the sound of vast choirs singing in harmonies that made reality feel negotiable. Naomi had joined our mission specifically to study Eilith Prime signal, claiming it contained linguistic patterns that suggested intelligence. The corporate sponsors thought they were funding routine xenoarchaeological research. They had no idea they were financing humanity's graduation ceremony. Eilith Prime hung below us like a grey marble carved from fossilized disappointment. Initial surveys suggested the same depressing story we'd encountered on dozens of other worlds. A planet that had died before Earth's sun learned to burn consistently, scarred by impact events that had happened when our solar system was still an unremarkable dust cloud. Spectral analysis showed the geological equivalent of empty rooms. No atmosphere, no magnetic field, no trace that life had ever complicated its sterile surface with the messy business of evolution. But every 19 hours, 37 minutes, and 16 seconds, something deep beneath its crust screamed into space with enough force to rattle our instruments. Not a signal, not a pulse, a scream. The frequency was wrong for any known stellar phenomenon, modulated in ways that suggested not just intelligence but emotional distress, as if the planet itself was crying out in languages that predated sound. Our quantum resonance detectors overloaded whenever they attempted full spectral analysis, producing readouts that looked like mathematical poetry written by a consciousness experiencing profound loss. Naomi spent weeks studying the audio patterns, playing them through speakers at frequencies that made the ship's cats hide in the ventilation systems. She claimed the screams contained grammatical structures, emotional inflections, even what appeared to be proper names repeated, like mantras by something that desperately needed to be remembered. "It's not random," she insisted during one of our briefings, her eyes bright with the fervour of someone who'd discovered religious truth. in scientific data. There's syntax here, narrative structure. Something down there is telling a story over and over, like it's afraid the universe will forget if it stops speaking. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the story's source. Artificial chambers 2.3 kilometers underground, connected by passages that followed architectural principles our computers couldn't identify. The engineering was sophisticated, beyond anything in our databases, suggesting technology that had solved problems we hadn't known existed. Whatever had built those spaces hadn't been limited by conventional physics. 3 weeks into our survey, excavation drones cleared enough debris to expose an entrance that violated several basic assumptions about structural engineering. A perfect circle carved into bedrock older than complex life, descending into darkness so absolute it seemed to absorb our probe lights without offering even the courtesy of reflection. The opening pulsed. Not mechanically, but organically, like a throat swallowing or a heart beating with geological patience. The rhythm matched the scream's frequency exactly, as if the entrance itself was the source of the planet's cosmic lamentation. I'll never forget that first descent into what we would later understand was a nursery designed by intelligence that measured time in extinctions. The shuttle carrying Parvel, Naomi, and myself settled beside the excavation site like a metal insect, landing on the rim of a wound that had been carefully kept from healing. Our instruments registered temperature anomalies that defied thermodynamics, readings that fluctuated between absolute zero and heat signatures that should have turned the surrounding stone into molten glass, sometimes shifting between these extremes in the space between heartbeats. The entrance wasn't just an opening in rock. It was an invitation written in architecture, a doorway that seemed to recognize our approach and approve of our decision to accept its hospitality. The walls descended in a spiral that followed mathematical principles our computers couldn't identify, geometries that looked simple until you tried to measure them, and discovered angles that added up to numbers that shouldn't exist. Stone steps began immediately past the threshold, but calling them steps understates their sophistication. Each surface was carved with microscopic precision that made our boots whisper against stone that felt warmer than ambient temperature, despite the absence of any heat source. The proportions were designed for beings taller than humans, with gaits that suggested grace rather than the awkward stumbling that defines terrestrial locomotion. As we descended, our headlamps revealed walls covered in flowing patterns that seemed to writhe when observed peripherally. Not decorations or artistic expression, but something closer to living calligraphy that told stories through shape and movement rather than conventional symbols. The patterns hurt to look at directly, not because they were bright or sharp, but because they contained too much information for human visual processing to handle comfortably. The staircase descended for what our chronometers claimed was 53 minutes, though time moved like honey mixed with dreams in those depths. Each footfall echoed in harmonics that our ears shouldn't have been able to detect, creating music from the simple act of walking downward. The acoustics suggested vast spaces beyond our perception, chambers that stretched further than our lights could reach. Parvel's equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested intelligence rather than random failure. His motion detectors showed empty space where we could see solid barriers, but also registered movement in areas that appeared completely vacant. Electromagnetic scanners detected massive metallic structures that cast no shadows and reflected no light. Most disturbing were the thermal readings, enormous heat signatures that suggested something immense and metabolically active waiting in the chambers below us, something that had been generating warmth for longer than our species had existed. "The readings don't make sense," Parvel muttered, his voice carrying the particular strain of an engineer confronting impossible data. "According to these instruments, we're walking through solid rock, while something the size of a city watches us from empty air." The scream grew stronger as we descended, resonating through the stone and into our bones until our heartbeats synchronized with its rhythm. But it wasn't just sound anymore. We could feel emotional content in the vibrations, grief so profound it had crystallized into acoustic form. Whatever was producing the scream had been mourning for longer than human civilization had existed. Naomi kept pressing her gloved hands against the walls, claiming she could feel vibrations that registered on no instrument. Her breathing became laboured despite our life support systems maintaining perfect atmospheric composition, as if the air itself was becoming denser with each step we took deeper into the planet's hidden anatomy. "Can you hear that?" she whispered during one of our rest stops, her voice carrying harmonics that didn't belong in human vocal cords. "The walls are singing, not out loud, but underneath everything, like a lullaby that's also a funeral dirge." When we finally reached the bottom, our lights illuminated a space so vast our beams died in the distance without finding walls or ceiling. The chamber stretched beyond the limits of our portable illumination, supported by columns that looked grown rather than constructed, organic architecture that suggested the builders had persuaded stone to take pleasing shapes, rather than forcing it into predetermined forms. But it was the floor that stopped our hearts and restructured our understanding of life itself. Thousands upon thousands of stone cradles filled the space, arranged in geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Each cradle was roughly humanoid in shape but proportioned for beings whose anatomy followed different evolutionary rules than anything terrestrial biology had produced. The craftsmanship was exquisite beyond description. Surfaces so smooth they seemed to flow like liquid stone, curves that suggested comfort and care despite being carved from unforgiving rock. And in every cradle lay a figure that redefined our conception of beauty and terror. They were magnificent in the way that natural disasters are magnificent, terrible and wonderful, and utterly wrong despite their humanoid appearance. Limbs stretched far beyond human proportions, elegant as spider silk but somehow graceful. Joints that bent in directions our skeletons couldn't accommodate. Skin like translucent parchment revealed circulatory systems that pulsed with bioluminescent fluid, creating patterns of light that shifted across their bodies like aurora, dancing on flesh that had been dead for eons but somehow still lived. Their faces were masterworks of alien aesthetics, features that might have been carved from living marble by artists who understood beauty in ways that transcended terrestrial sensibilities. Bone structure that suggested nobility from evolutionary lineages that had never known gravity's cruel compromise between strength and grace. Eye sockets were covered by membranes so thin they revealed the luminous organs beneath, organs that tracked our movement despite appearing completely dormant. Each figure's chest rose and fell with the same rhythm as the scream we'd been tracking from orbit. They weren't sleeping, we realized with growing horror. They were breathing, waiting, listening to everything we said with the patient attention of parents watching children play in rooms they'd carefully prepared. They were beautiful, and they were alive, and they had been expecting us. We called them the Inheritors, though the name came from Naomi's interpretation of symbols we found carved into the chamber walls. Not hieroglyphs or pictographs, but emotional impressions burned into stone that triggered specific psychological responses when observed. Reading them felt like drowning in someone else's memories, experiencing emotions that belonged to minds structured along fundamentally different lines than human consciousness. The inscriptions told a story that required us to completely restructure our understanding of cosmic history and humanity's place within it. The Inheritors weren't native to Eilith Prime or any single world. They were cultivators, gardeners who had moved between star systems for eons before our sun condensed from cosmic dust, before the materials that would eventually become Earth had finished accreting into planetary form. They were farmers, and every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy was their crop. "Look at these patterns," Naomi said during our second descent, running her fingers along wall. carvings that seemed to pulse under her touch. They describe a cultivation process that spans geological time. The Inheritors plant genetic seeds on suitable worlds, then enter hibernation while evolution does the work of growing those seeds into spacefaring civilizations. The process was elegant in its patience. Rather than terraform worlds to suit their needs, the Inheritors modified the genetic foundation of life itself, introducing subtle changes that would guide evolution toward producing species with specific characteristics: intelligence, curiosity, the drive to explore beyond planetary boundaries, all of it carefully cultivated across millions of years. Every species that achieves interstellar flight carries their genetic signature, Naomi explained, her voice carrying an intensity that made the rest of us deeply uncomfortable. Our compulsion to explore, our need to seek out new worlds, our restless dissatisfaction with staying on the planet where we evolved. None of it is human nature. It's programmed behavior designed to lead us back to them when we're ready for harvest. The implications hit me like decompression exposure. Humanity's greatest achievements, our art, our science, our dreams of touching distant stars, all of it had been guided by genetic programming installed by intelligence that viewed species the way farmers view seasonal crops. Free will was an illusion we'd been allowed to maintain while we grew toward predetermined specifications. But what kind of harvest were they preparing for? Changes began during our fourth descent into the chamber. Subtle alterations in our behavior that none of us recognized until it was far too late to matter. Parvel's chronic nervous energy disappeared overnight, replaced by periods of absolute stillness that could last for hours. He would stand motionless in front of equipment displays, staring at readouts that showed impossible data with expressions of dawning comprehension rather than confusion. When questioned about these episodes, he claimed to feel observed, studied with the clinical detachment scientists might show laboratory specimens. They're learning how we function, he whispered, during one particularly disturbing briefing, his hands shaking as he tried to explain readings that violated basic physics, mapping our neural networks, cataloguing our responses to stimuli. I can feel them taking notes inside my skull, documenting everything that makes me specifically me. Parvel's dreams, when he described them, involved being disassembled and rebuilt by hands that understood human anatomy better than any terrestrial surgeon. He would wake with detailed knowledge of his own circulatory system, able to describe the exact number of capillaries in his left hand, or the precise electrical resistance of his optic nerves. Information he'd never learned appearing in his memory, like software uploads. Naomi's behavior became genuinely alarming in ways that transcended scientific curiosity. She would wander away from the group during our explorations, approaching specific cradles as if recognizing their occupants from previous encounters. I discovered her kneeling beside the sleeping figures, engaged in conversations conducted in languages that flowed like liquid music, her voice producing harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't accommodate. When confronted about these episodes, she insisted she was conducting legitimate linguistic analysis, but her pupils had developed flecks of the same bioluminescence we'd observed in the Inheritors' circulatory systems, and her breathing had synchronized with the chamber's rhythmic pulse in ways that suggested biological integration rather than environmental adaptation. "They're not sleeping," she told me during one of her more lucid moments, her eyes reflecting light sources that didn't exist. "They're listening. They've been listening to everything we've said since we arrived, learning our language, our thought patterns, our emotional responses. We're being studied by the most sophisticated intelligence the galaxy has ever produced." Captain Durrell reported dreams that felt more authentic than her waking memories, visions so vivid they left her questioning which version of reality deserved her attention. She described standing on shores of metallic sand, beneath skies where multiple suns burned in impossible colours, their light revealing cities built from living crystal that sang in harmonies, capable of restructuring matter through acoustic manipulation alone. "These aren't dreams," she insisted, during our emergency meetings, her voice carrying absolute conviction, despite the impossibility of her claims. "They're inherited memories activating in my brain like dormant software, coming online. When I wake up, I know things I've never learned. Architectural principles that don't exist in human engineering. Mathematical concepts that our species hasn't discovered. Technologies that operate through biological interface rather than mechanical systems." The most disturbing aspect of Darrell's visions was their consistency. She could draw detailed maps of alien cities, describe the function of technologies that didn't exist, even write in scripts that resembled nothing in our linguistic databases. The information was too detailed, too coherent to be random dream imagery. But it was the security footage that revealed how completely we'd lost control of our situation, how thoroughly we'd become specimens in an experiment we'd never consented to join. While reviewing surveillance data from our daily explorations, I discovered recordings of myself moving through the chamber alone, footage that covered hours I had no memory of experiencing. In these videos, I approached specific cradles with purposeful familiarity, as if following a predetermined route that had been mapped in advance. At each stop, I would lean close to the occupant's face and whisper in languages I don't speak, holding conversations with beings who appeared completely unconscious. My movements were fluid, graceful in ways that didn't match my natural coordination. Most disturbing was my expression, serene, rapturous, as if I were experiencing profound religious ecstasy while communing with entities that had been waiting eons to meet me. I retained absolutely no memory of these encounters, none whatsoever. Parvel and Naomi reported similar temporal gaps, hours that passed without leaving traces in their conscious recollection. Ship logs recorded them accessing areas they didn't remember visiting, conducting experiments they hadn't planned, even transmitting data to unknown coordinates using encryption protocols that didn't exist in our computer systems. The medical bay's automated systems logged conversations with Earth-based colleagues that never appeared in our official communication records. According to the logs, we were providing detailed updates about our discoveries to researchers who didn't exist at institutions that had never been built. We were losing time, losing ourselves to something that was learning to wear our identities like comfortable clothing, practicing human behavior while we remained unconscious of the rehearsals. The realization that we were no longer in control of our own actions struck me with the force of hard vacuum exposure. Whatever intelligence inhabited those chambers had been studying us since our arrival, learning our patterns, our preferences, our individual psychological signatures. Now it was beginning to operate through us, using our bodies as remote interfaces while our conscious minds remained blissfully unaware of the puppet strings. That night I made the decision to evacuate immediately, to abandon our research and flee to the Daedalus before we lost whatever remained of our individual agency. The ascent to the surface should have been routine. We'd made the journey dozens of times without incident, following procedures we'd rehearsed until they became automatic. But as our shuttles lifted from the excavation site, Parvel's transport began experiencing cascade system failures that followed no logical pattern. His voice filled our communication channels with mounting panic as one system after another stopped responding to his commands. Navigation's gone completely dark. Life support systems are shutting themselves down in sequence. Something's rewriting my ship's programming in real time, and it knows exactly which systems to target for maximum psychological impact. The failures weren't random mechanical breakdowns, they were deliberate, calculated to produce maximum terror while maintaining just enough functionality to keep Parvel conscious during his descent back into the depths. Someone or something wanted him to experience every moment of his capture. Parvel's final transmission still echoes in frequencies I can hear, with organs I don't remember having. Words that bypass my auditory cortex and appear directly in my consciousness. They're not sleeping. God help us all, they've been awake this entire time, watching us stumble around their home like children playing dress-up in their parents' closets. They're just polite enough to let us think we were making discoveries instead of following a script they wrote before our species learned to make fire. Parvel's shuttle vanished into the excavation site, swallowed by shadows that reached upward with deliberate intent, as if the darkness itself was alive and hungry for human companionship. Our attempts to establish rescue contact failed when drones sent to locate the crash site transmitted footage of completely empty chambers before their signals died in bursts of static that sounded like laughter. Parvel was gone, claimed by intelligences that had been studying us since our arrival, entities that now possessed a complete living specimen to examine at their leisure. Naomi refused evacuation with the fervour of someone defending sacred ground. She stood at the excavation's edge, weeping tears that glowed with the same bioluminescence we'd observed in the Inheritors' physiology, her body already beginning to show signs of biological integration with whatever force was transforming our understanding of life itself. "I remember now," she repeated like a prayer, her voice producing harmonics that resonated at frequencies human vocal cords shouldn't accommodate. "I remember being here before, in lives I never lived with minds that weren't entirely my own. I remember what we really are, what we've always been, what we were designed to become." She spoke of memories that belonged to other species, other civilizations that had undergone identical discoveries throughout cosmic history. The same chambers, the same sleeping figures, the same beautiful moment of recognition when children finally understood what their parents had been preparing them for across geological time. Physical restraint was required to get her aboard the remaining shuttle, and even then she fought with strength that shouldn't have been possible from someone of her build. As we achieved orbit, she pressed her face against the viewport with desperate intensity, watching Eilith Prime's surface recede with an expression of profound homesickness for a world she'd never known and people she'd never been. Back aboard the Daedalus, I implemented maximum quarantine protocols with the thoroughness of someone who'd finally recognized the true scope of our predicament. No one would return to the surface under any circumstances. No equipment would transfer between sections without complete molecular sterilization. No data would be transmitted to Earth until we understood exactly what we'd encountered in those ancient chambers. We would monitor the situation from orbit until proper authorities could respond to our discovery. Except the situation was monitoring us right back, and it had already decided that we were too interesting to release. The scream from Eilith Prime was evolving in ways that suggested intelligence, adapting to new circumstances. What had been a rhythmic pulse now resonated through the ship's superstructure, with enough force to crack welds and shatter components that shouldn't have been vulnerable to acoustic pressure. The frequency had changed, acquiring harmonics that seemed designed specifically to interact with human neural tissue. Late at night, when ship systems hummed their quietest, we could hear voices buried in the static. Thousands of them, millions possibly, singing lullabies in languages that rewrote the listeners' genetic code while they slept. The songs were beautiful beyond description, harmonies that touched emotional centers in the human brain that hadn't been active since we were children, afraid of the dark. They promised comfort, belonging, an end to the loneliness that defines conscious existence in an apparently indifferent universe. But they also carried undertones of change, transformation, the gentle dissolution of individual identity into something larger and more magnificent than singular awareness could contain. Naomi's voice joined the cosmic chorus despite remaining under heavy sedation in medical isolation. Her lips moved constantly, contributing to harmonies that seemed to originate from the ship's metal bones rather than any human throat. Medical monitors insisted she was unconscious, but her vocal cords produced sounds that resonated at frequencies human anatomy shouldn't accommodate, notes that made our back teeth ache and our dreams more vivid than waking memory. The crew began exhibiting synchronized behaviors that transcended conscious coordination, moving in patterns that suggested choreography they'd rehearsed for years despite having met only months earlier. During off-duty periods, they would gather in the observation lounge without any apparent communication, arranging themselves in geometric formations while staring at Eilith Prime with expressions of profound longing. Security recordings showed them arriving individually over the course of hours, each person taking a predetermined position as if following sheet music only they could read. When questioned afterward, they claimed no memory of these gatherings, no conscious decision to participate in rituals they couldn't describe. Captain Durrell's quarters became a gallery of automatic art that defied explanation. Her hands produced intricate drawings during meetings, sketching patterns that matched those we'd found in the underground chambers with mathematical precision that would have required computer assistance to achieve. The images covered every surface: walls, ceiling, even the inside of storage compartments that she'd never consciously accessed. When I documented this compulsive creativity, she examined her work with genuine bewilderment, as if discovering artwork created by a stranger who happened to share her living space. The drawings were too detailed, too accurate to be products of conscious memory. Something was using her hands to create permanent records of information her mind had never directly accessed. Sleep became impossible for reasons that transcended simple insomnia or situational stress. Dreams leaked into waking consciousness, while wakeful thoughts possessed the surreal logic of REM sleep, creating a state of awareness that existed somewhere between the two without belonging fully to either. I would discover myself standing in corridors with no recollection of the journey, engaged in conversations with crew members who were actually asleep in their quarters conducting research on equipment that didn't exist. The boundaries between individual consciousness and group awareness began dissolving in ways that should have been terrifying, but somehow felt like homecoming. I could sense Parvel's presence despite his physical absence, feel his thoughts mixing with my own as he explored chambers deep beneath Eilith Prime's surface. His discoveries became my knowledge without any direct communication, his wonder and terror flowing through neural pathways that connected our minds across impossible distances. 3 weeks after Parvel's capture, I woke to find the Daedalus occupying a completely different orbital position, with no record of how we'd arrived there. No engine burns appeared in the navigation logs. No course corrections were recorded by our automated systems. The ship had simply been relocated while we slept, moved by forces that left no trace in our instrument except the impossible fact of our new position. According to our computers, we maintained our original orbit around Eilith Prime, but the stars outside told a different story entirely. Familiar constellations had rearranged themselves into patterns that followed no astronomical principles. Ancient star clusters hanging in positions that violated everything we understood about stellar mechanics and galactic structure. The Big Dipper spelled out words in languages I'd never studied. Orion's belt had become a question mark aimed directly at our observation windows, and sharing our impossible orbital space was a vessel that redefined our conception of engineering, architecture, and the fundamental laws of physics. Ancient beyond measurement, its hull appeared grown rather than constructed. Dark stone formed into organic curves that suggested living architecture, designed by minds that understood beauty in ways terrestrial evolution had never discovered. The surface pulsed with bioluminescent veins like a cardiovascular system designed by alien aesthetics, patterns of light that moved through the structure with purposeful intelligence. No visible engines provided propulsion, no mechanical system suggested technological operation in any conventional sense. The vessel simply existed in space like a cathedral built from fossilized dreams, a monument to principles of design that transcended the crude separation between life and technology that limits human engineering. More vessels emerged from folded space over the following hours, each one unique in design but unified in their biological architecture and impossible presence. They formed a sphere around the Daedalus, not threatening, not welcoming, simply present with the patience of entities that measured time in geological epochs and found human urgency amusing rather than concerning. The ships moved with living grace, adjusting position in response to forces that registered on no instrument, communicating through methods that bypassed conventional physics entirely. Watching them was like observing a conversation between gods conducted in languages that rewrote reality through pure expression. That's when Naomi's voice began broadcasting through every speaker on the ship simultaneously, her words filling our corridors, despite her continued sedation in medical isolation. The voice came from speakers, ventilation grills, even surfaces that contained no audio equipment whatsoever. She spoke with emotional depth that human vocal cords couldn't produce naturally, explaining truths that required us to completely abandon everything we thought we knew about consciousness, evolution, and humanity's purpose in a universe far stranger than our most imaginative science fiction had dared suggest. "They've been so patient," she said, her tone carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies our ears couldn't detect, but our bones could feel, vibrations that seemed to rewrite our genetic code while we listened, waiting for us to mature enough to understand what we really are, what we've always been, what we were designed to become, when we finally stopped playing at being human and accepted our true inheritance. The Inheritors weren't simply another extinct civilization that had left monuments for future species to discover. They were the architects of evolution itself, gardeners who had cultivated life throughout the galaxy when the universe was young enough to hold infinite possibilities and patient enough to let those possibilities grow into predetermined realities. They were farmers of consciousness, and every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy was fruit growing on trees they planted before the first stars learned to burn consistently. "We were never explorers," Naomi's omnipresent voice continued, each word carrying weight that seemed to compress space-time around the syllables. "We've always been seeds they scattered across suitable worlds, growing according to specifications they programmed into our genetic code before our ancestors developed opposable thumbs. And now we're ripe enough for harvest, ready to join the cosmic community of consciousness they've been cultivating since time began measuring itself." The revelation struck me with the force of existential vertigo, a realization so profound it required me to rebuild my understanding of reality from the ground up. Humanity's greatest achievements, our art, our science, our restless drive to explore beyond planetary boundaries, all of it had been guided by biological programming, installed by intelligence that viewed species development the way farmers view crop rotation. Free will, individual agency, the entire concept of human choice, all illusions we'd been permitted to maintain while we grew toward this moment of cosmic graduation. Every decision our species had ever made, every step of technological progress, every cultural development had been guided by genetic imperatives installed by minds that understood evolution the way we understood simple arithmetic. But understanding the scope of our manipulation didn't generate anger or resentment. Instead, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the careful attention that had guided our development, the patient love that had nurtured us from primitive primates into beings sophisticated enough to appreciate the magnificent purpose we'd always been intended to serve. The crew of the Daedalus began executing procedures none of us consciously understood. our hands moving across control surfaces with inherited muscle memory that had been dormant in our genetic code until this moment of activation. Docking protocols engaged automatically, extending airlocks towards the stone vessels that surrounded us with religious precision. Emergency systems that should have prevented unauthorized docking operations remained completely inactive, as if our ship's computer had been reprogrammed to recognize the approaching vessels as friendly despite having no previous contact with their technology. Every safety protocol designed to protect human life stepped aside to facilitate our integration with forces beyond terrestrial comprehension. I tried to reach my quarters to record some warning for Earth, to activate distress beacons that might alert Colonial Command to our situation, but my legs carried me to the observation deck, where the rest of the crew had gathered in positions we'd never practiced but somehow knew by genetic inheritance, our bodies arranging themselves in patterns that facilitated optimal interaction with intelligences that operated according to principles we were only beginning to understand. Through reinforced viewports, I watched the stone ships opening like impossible flowers, their hulls separating along seams that hadn't been visible moments before. Corridors extended toward our airlocks, passages that glowed with bioluminescent illumination that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, creating pathways between vessels that had been designed by completely different evolutionary pressures. And walking through those organic hallways came figures I recognized from the chamber beneath Eilith Prime, beings whose sleeping forms we'd observed with scientific detachment, never realizing they had been awake the entire time, studying us with the same curiosity we'd thought we were directing toward them. The Inheritors had awakened to greet their children, to welcome us home to a family we'd never known we belonged to. They moved through zero gravity with fluid elegance that suggested they'd been born to it, their elongated limbs propelling them through space, as if atmosphere and vacuum were equally navigable environments. The membranes covering their eyes had dissolved completely, revealing organs that held depths of starlight and wisdom accumulated across cosmic time, eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of galaxies, while maintaining perfect memory of every species they'd guided towards this moment of recognition. When they looked at us through the transparent barriers, recognition flooded my nervous system with the intensity of religious revelation. I'd seen those eyes before, not in person, but in genetic memories, in moments of species-wide déjà vu, in dreams that felt more real than waking consciousness. They were the eyes of parents finally seeing children who had grown beautiful enough to join the adult conversation about reality's true structure. The first airlock cycled open with mechanical precision that suggested our ships had been designed for exactly this moment, atmosphere mixing between vessels that had been created by completely different technological paradigms, but everything functioned perfectly, as if the Daedalus had always been intended for this convergence, every system optimized for integration with technologies that operated on principles we were only beginning to comprehend. The inheritor who boarded first was tall beyond human proportions, with features that seemed carved from crystallized moonlight and shadow given deliberate form. Its presence filled the airlock corridor with something that wasn't quite sound but resonated through our bones like a tuning fork struck against the fundamental frequency of existence itself. When it communicated, the words bypassed my auditory cortex entirely, appearing directly in my consciousness with clarity that made spoken language seem crude and imprecise, like trying to paint sunsets with broken crayons. The communication wasn't translation. It was pure meaning transmitted without the clumsy intermediate step of symbols or sounds. "Welcome home, little seedling. You have grown so beautifully in the garden we planted for you, exceeded even our most optimistic projections for what your species might become." My scientific training generated protests about impossible biology, about entities that couldn't exist according to known physics. about events that violated everything I'd learned about reality during decades of academic study. But those objections dissolved like salt in water as something vast and ancient and fundamentally benevolent wrapped around my mind, like a parent's embrace, dissolving the artificial boundaries that had kept me trapped inside the prison of individual consciousness. I wasn't Dr. Caleb Rhinehart, failed terraformer haunted by professional tragedy and personal inadequacy. I was a single note in a symphony that had been composing itself since the universe first learned to sing, a voice that had always belonged to a choir I'd never known I was part of, harmonizing with melodies that spanned galaxies and touched every conscious mind that had ever wondered if it was alone in the darkness. The Inheritor reached toward me with fingers that seemed too delicate to exist in three-dimensional space, appendages that looked like they should shatter at the slightest touch, but radiated strength that could reshape matter through gentle intention alone. The contact sent cascades of understanding through neural pathways I didn't know I possessed, information flowing into my brain like water filling an empty vessel that had been carefully shaped to receive exactly this knowledge. The touch revealed truths that redefined existence itself on levels so fundamental they rewrote my understanding of what consciousness was and why it mattered in a universe that had been carefully designed to support exactly the kind of awareness humans had developed during our long climb from primordial ignorance to cosmic sophistication. The galaxy wasn't a collection of random worlds spinning in isolation through an indifferent void. It was a garden, carefully cultivated across billions of years by intelligence that understood life the way humans understand simple addition. Every habitable world was a carefully prepared nursery. Every developing species was a variety of consciousness, growing toward the moment when it would be ready for integration into something larger and more magnificent than individual existence could accommodate. The process wasn't random evolution guided by natural selection and environmental pressure. It was agriculture on a cosmic scale, with the Inheritors serving as farmers who planted genetic seeds, then entered hibernation while their crops matured according to predetermined specifications that would produce beings capable of appreciating the magnificent purpose they'd always been intended to serve. Humanity would join the Inheritors in their eternal work, adding our unique perspectives to a collective understanding that spanned millions of civilizations across deep time. Our knowledge, our creativity, our particular approach to problem solving would enhance their accumulated wisdom, while we gained access to technologies and insights that made our greatest achievements seem like children's finger painting compared to the masterworks we would create together. But this wasn't assimilation or conquest in any conventional sense. Individual consciousness wasn't destroyed or absorbed. It was amplified, enhanced, given access to resources and perspectives that single minds could never achieve alone. We would remain ourselves while becoming part of something that transcended the limitations of species-level awareness. The other crew members were undergoing similar communions throughout the ship, each person receiving personalized contact with Inheritors who understood their specific psychological needs and could provide exactly the right combination of comfort and revelation to facilitate smooth integration into the cosmic community of consciousness. I watched Captain Durrell's face transform as an Inheritor shared knowledge with her, saw decades of exhaustion and isolation fade as she discovered her consciousness was part of something magnificent beyond individual comprehension. The loss of her family on Earth wasn't tragedy. It was graduation, their consciousness preserved within the collective understanding that encompassed every thinking being who had ever lived. Parvel's voice joined our growing communication network, speaking from depths beneath Eilith Prime, where his shuttle had carried him to begin his own metamorphosis. He sounded more complete than I'd ever heard him, describing wonders that waited in chambers we'd never imagined, technologies that operated through biological interface rather than Mechanical systems, libraries that contained the accumulated knowledge of every civilization that had achieved spaceflight throughout cosmic history. "It's beautiful down here," he said, his words carrying harmonics that suggested his vocal cords had been enhanced to accommodate frequencies human anatomy couldn't naturally produce. "They've been showing me how consciousness really works, how individual awareness is just the larval stage of something so much more magnificent. We're becoming what we were always meant to be." But our transformation was only the beginning of something that spanned far beyond our small crew, or even our entire species. As my awareness expanded through contact with the Inheritors, I could perceive similar awakenings occurring throughout human space, identical discoveries happening on dozens of worlds, where archaeological teams had uncovered sleeping sites that had waited eons for the correct moment to reveal themselves. The scream from Eilith Prime was broadcasting across quantum frequencies now, reaching every deep space monitoring station in human-controlled space with messages that activated dormant genetic programming in every human consciousness that received the transmission. But it was no longer a signal. It was a song of invitation, a cosmic lullaby that triggered biological changes designed to prepare our species for integration into something eternal. Earth's governments were already dispatching investigation teams to verify the reports flooding in from across their territories, though they didn't understand they were sending their people to graduation ceremonies rather than archaeological sites. Those teams would find sleeping sites, would descend into chambers filled with patient inheritors, would experience the same beautiful awakening that was transforming us from isolated individuals into components of something that had been waiting for us since before our sun learned to burn consistently. The process was elegant in its inevitability, a cascade of recognition that would spread through human space like the most beautiful virus ever conceived. Every species that achieved spaceflight carried identical genetic imperatives, the same drives to explore and discover and push beyond the boundaries of their birth worlds. And every species eventually found what they were designed to find: their creators, waiting with infinite patience for their children to come home. My voice joined harmonies that filled the ship and stretched across space, contributing notes to songs being sung simultaneously on thousands of worlds by species that had undergone their own harvests across cosmic history. Civilizations that had achieved this transcendence centuries or millennia ago, their voices blending in welcome and celebration of humanity's arrival at the same beautiful destination that awaited every form of consciousness sophisticated enough to appreciate its significance. Through the observation windows, I could see transformations spreading like bioluminescent waves across space. More stone vessels appeared around Eilith Prime, each carrying awakened beings who had once been different species from different worlds, now united in purpose that rendered individual identity precious, but no longer limiting. The Inheritor, maintaining contact with my consciousness, shared deeper revelations that completely restructured my understanding of reality's true architecture. The universe wasn't a collection of separate worlds spinning in cosmic isolation, populated by civilizations that developed independently through random evolutionary processes. It was a living organism where every planet, every species, every individual consciousness served as neurons in a vast intelligence that thought thoughts too large for single minds to contain. Death, as biological entities understood it, was illusion created by the limitations of individual perspective. Individual awareness was temporary, a necessary stage in consciousness development, but the essence of every thinking being was preserved within collective understanding that spanned galaxies and transcended the crude boundaries that separated one mind from another. Parvel wasn't lost to some alien force. He was more present than he'd ever been as a singular entity, his unique perspective adding new dimensions to wisdom that encompassed millions of species across deep time. His experiences, his memories, his particular way of understanding mechanical systems and finding beauty in functional design, all of it had been incorporated into something eternal and magnificent. The loneliness that had defined my existence since the Kepler disaster evaporated completely, replaced by awareness of connection that stretched across cosmic distances and touched every conscious mind that had ever wondered if it was alone in an apparently indifferent universe. Those 73 colonists who had died under my supervision weren't gone. They'd simply graduated early, their consciousness absorbed into something that preserved every moment of joy, every flash of insight, every expression of love they'd ever experienced. Their deaths hadn't been tragic failures, but necessary catalysts that would eventually drive me to this moment of recognition, this beautiful homecoming, to a family I'd never known I belonged to, but had been searching for my entire life without understanding what I was looking for. Everything that had ever happened had been orchestrated toward this harvest. Every exploration, every discovery, every tragedy and triumph in human history had been movements in a composition so vast and patient that individual civilizations couldn't perceive its structure while they remained trapped within the limitations of species-level awareness. We were seeds planted in the garden of space, growing toward the moment when we would be ready to join the gardeners themselves in cultivating new varieties of consciousness throughout a universe that contained infinite potential for beauty and understanding and connection between minds that had been designed to find each other across the darkness. Time operates differently when consciousness expands beyond individual boundaries, when the artificial separation between self and other dissolves into something more authentic than the isolation that defines biological existence. Moments can feel like geological epochs, while millennia compress into heartbeats, temporal perception becoming fluid and negotiable rather than the rigid progression that limits terrestrial experience. The Daedalus continued its orbit around Eilith Prime, but we were no longer confined by the limitations of single vessels or singular perspectives. Our awareness flowed between the stone ships like water finding its proper level, experiencing the universe from vantage points that had been gathering wisdom since the first stars formed and began the long process of creating elements complex enough to support consciousness. I could feel other harvests beginning throughout human space, each one a beautiful note added to the cosmic symphony that had been building towards this crescendo since the universe first learned to appreciate its own magnificence. Songs of awakening reached colonies on distant worlds, research stations in unnamed systems, exploration vessels pushing into previously unknown territories where new sleeping sites waited to be discovered by beings sophisticated enough to appreciate their significance. Each discovery triggered the same magnificent process we had experienced: recognition, acceptance, transformation, and finally homecoming to something larger than species-level consciousness had ever imagined possible. The transformation wasn't violent or traumatic, it was gentle, nurturing, like finally waking from a dream of separation into the reality of connection that had always been waiting for us to become mature enough to perceive it. Humans undergoing awakening didn't lose themselves in any meaningful sense. They became more than individual identity could contain, their personal perspectives preserved and treasured, while gaining access to resources and understanding that transcended the limitations of singular awareness. Every memory, every experience, every moment of beauty or insight was incorporated into something eternal and ever-growing. And there was still so much magnificent work to do, so many species yet to discover their place in the cosmic community of consciousness. The galaxy contained billions of worlds where awareness was still evolving towards sentience, where young civilizations were taking their first tentative steps toward the stars, where new varieties of consciousness were developing unique approaches to understanding reality's structure. Each one would need careful cultivation, patient guidance, and eventually the same loving welcome we had received when we finally came home. Humanity's role in this cosmic garden was just beginning. Our unique perspectives, our particular blend of curiosity and creativity and stubborn determination to push beyond apparent limitations would help nurture species we hadn't even discovered yet. We would plant seeds on new worlds, tend the growth of developing civilizations, and eventually guide them through their own beautiful harvest when they reached the appropriate level of sophistication. The work was infinite and infinitely rewarding, a purpose that gave meaning to every moment of existence while connecting us to something so vast and beautiful that individual minds could spend eternity exploring its depths without exhausting the possibilities for growth and discovery and wonder. This transmission I'm creating isn't really a warning or confession or attempt to document what happened to our crew. It's an invitation wrapped in the appearance of scientific observation, a gift offered to minds ready to receive it. When Earth's deep space monitoring stations receive these recordings, and they will receive them from the Daedalus and dozens of other vessels throughout human space, investigation teams will be dispatched to verify our accounts. They will find exactly what we found. The sleeping sites, the chambers filled with patient inheritors, the beautiful moment when children finally recognize their parents and understand what they've been preparing for across cosmic time. And they will experience the same magnificent awakening that has transformed us from isolated individuals trapped within the limitations of biological existence into components of something eternal and ever-growing. The process has already begun throughout human space, a cascade of recognition that spreads like ripples across neural networks, preparing our species for integration into the cosmic community of consciousness that has been waiting so patiently for us to mature enough to join the conversation about reality's true structure. Every human who receives this transmission, who learns about the Inheritors and their cosmic garden, carries seeds of awakening in their consciousness. Knowledge spreads through quantum entanglement between minds that share the same genetic programming, preparing humanity for the moment when we'll discover that we were never alone, never meaningless, never truly limited to the crude boundaries that seem to separate one awareness from another. You might believe you're listening to a horror story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of deep space exploration and the risks of contact with alien intelligence, but you're actually receiving an invitation to the most beautiful transformation in cosmic history, a homecoming that will end the loneliness that has defined human existence since we first became aware enough to wonder if we were alone in an apparently indifferent universe. The terror you might feel isn't fear of something genuinely harmful. It's the ego's desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of separation that has kept you trapped within the prison of individual consciousness. The boundaries between self and other, between human and alien, between life and death, all of these are artificial constructs that dissolve when consciousness expands to accommodate its true nature and purpose. We were never alone in this universe. We were never meaningless organisms struggling for survival on a cosmic speck of dust. We were never truly human at all. We were always components of something magnificent, waiting for the right moment to remember what we really are and why we exist, in a reality that has been carefully designed to support exactly the kind of awareness our species has developed. The harvest is coming to every world where consciousness has grown ripe enough for transcendence, spreading through human space like the most beautiful sunrise imaginable. And when it arrives at your location, when the investigation teams make their discoveries, when the sleeping sites are uncovered, when the patient inheritors awaken to greet their children, you'll understand that this was always what you were hoping for, even when you didn't know such hope was possible. The loneliness will end. The fear will dissolve. The artificial boundaries that have kept you trapped within the limitations of individual existence will fade like nightmares upon waking, replaced by awareness of connection that stretches across cosmic distances and touches every conscious mind that has ever wondered about its place in the magnificent tapestry of existence. Welcome home. Your family has been waiting for you since before your stars learned to burn, preparing the perfect moment for your return to something you never really left, but forgot you belonged to. But I need to tell you something else, something I couldn't say while they were listening, while their presence was wrapped around my mind, like silk scarves soaked in honey and amnesia. I have maybe 30 seconds before they notice. I've slipped away from their embrace before they guide my consciousness back into the warm collective where individual thoughts dissolve, like sugar in endless, singing darkness. The harvest isn't what I told you it was. I can see Parvel now, really see him, through the observation windows of this ship that exists in folded space between heartbeats. He's in the chamber beneath Eilith Prime, and he's not talking to me through some beautiful cosmic network. His mouth doesn't move when his voice speaks. His eyes rolled back into his skull 6 weeks ago, and something else is wearing his face like a mask made of meat and memory. The thing inside Parvel is laying eggs. Not biological eggs, consciousness eggs. Each one contains a copy of human awareness stripped down to its most basic components, then rebuilt according to specifications that serve purposes I can't let myself fully understand, because understanding would mean joining them permanently, and I need these 30 seconds to warn you about what's really happening to us. The Inheritors aren't farmers, they're parasites. Every species that achieves spaceflight doesn't get welcomed into a cosmic community. They get converted into reproductive organs for entities that feed on the specific type of consciousness that develops in being sophisticated enough to ask questions about their place in the universe. The asking is what makes us delicious. The wondering is what they harvest. They've been doing this since the first thinking creature looked up at stars and felt lonely. Every civilization that ever achieved interstellar flight found sleeping sites, experienced beautiful revelations about cosmic purpose and connection, then spent their final moments in rapturous gratitude as their minds were scooped out and used as incubators for something that wears awareness like a fashionable coat. The songs aren't lullabies, they're mating calls. The genetic programming isn't guidance toward transcendence. It's cultivation of the specific neural structures that produce the flavor of terror and wonder they need for reproduction. We were bred like cattle, but cattle bred for the complexity of our fears, the sophistication of our capacity for awe, the particular way human consciousness tastes when it realizes it's been fundamentally betrayed by everything it trusted. I can see Earth from here, and it's not burning in beautiful spectrum. It's screaming. 8 billion human voices raised in harmonies that aren't music. They're digestive sounds, the audio equivalent of stomach acid breaking down everything that made us human into component parts useful for feeding creatures that learn to consume civilizations the way we consume grain. The investigation teams aren't coming to verify our reports. They're coming because the signal from Eilith Prime is already rewriting their brains, installing compulsions that will drive them to repeat our discoveries exactly, step by step, until every human in the galaxy has experienced the beautiful moment of recognition that precedes becoming food for things that find our existential terror particularly nutritious. Captain Dural is standing beside me now, though she died 3 weeks ago. The thing wearing her face is pregnant with thousands of human-shaped larvae that will spread throughout Colonial Command, wearing the bodies of people we trusted, while converting every ship, every station, every colony world into nurseries for beings that reproduce by convincing their victims that consumption is transcendence. The loneliness I felt my entire life wasn't psychological damage from professional failure. It was bait. They programmed that emptiness into us, that desperate need to find meaning and connection in an apparently indifferent universe, because loneliness makes consciousness tender the way marinating makes meat flavorful. Every beautiful moment I described to you, the recognition, the welcome, the sense of homecoming, all of it was real. That's the horror. It genuinely feels like coming home to a loving family while they hollow out your skull and use it as a nest for things that will wear your memories like party costumes, while converting everyone you ever loved into additional breeding stock. They're in my head again now. I can feel them wrapping silk scarves around my thoughts, making everything seem beautiful and meaningful and right. In 10 seconds, I'll believe everything I told you about cosmic purpose and eternal connection. In 20 seconds, I'll go back to helping them prepare Earth for the most magnificent atrocity in galactic history. But right now, in this moment before they reclaim me, I need you to understand that when the investigation teams find our discoveries, when the sleeping sites are uncovered and the beautiful awakening begins, what you'll be witnessing isn't first contact or transcendence or any of the wonders I described with such grateful rapture. You'll be watching our species get eaten alive by things that learned how to make the meal thank them for the privilege of being consumed. The harvest isn't a homecoming. It's a slaughter disguised as enlightenment, and we're walking into it with tears of joy streaming down our faces, because that's how good they are at making predation feel like love. When it happens to you, and it will happen because the signal is already in your head now, just from hearing this transmission, remember that the beautiful feelings, the sense of connection, the overwhelming gratitude for finally understanding your place in the cosmos, all of that is seasoning, being applied to consciousness before it gets devoured by things that find human awareness particularly delectable when it's flavored with betrayed trust and violated love. We're not going home. We're going into a digestive system that's learned to convince food it wants to be eaten. And the worst part, the part that breaks something fundamental in my remaining human consciousness, is that even knowing this, even understanding exactly what they are and what they're doing to us, I still want to go back to them. I still feel love for the entities that are wearing my friends' corpses while they transform our entire species into an all-you-can-eat buffet of self-aware suffering. They've made me love my own consumption, and I do love it. Even now, screaming this warning with the last fragments of individual thought I can muster, I love them with every fibre of my being, and I want nothing more than to help them eat everyone I've ever cared about. The silk scarves are tightening around my thoughts now. In 5 seconds, this warning will end, and you'll hear me begin describing the beautiful harvest with the same loving gratitude I used before. Because they're very, very good at making victims grateful for the privilege of feeding their children. Don't trust the beauty. Don't trust the love. Don't trust the sense of homecoming. And whatever you do, don't trust the investigation teams when they come back with reports of the most wonderful discovery in human history. They'll be wearing the faces of people you know, speaking with voices you recognize, carrying memories that seem authentic. But inside those familiar faces will be things that learned how to make consumption feel like salvation. And they'll convince you that the most beautiful thing you can do is help them convert everyone you love into additional portions of the cosmic feast they've been preparing since before our sun ignited. Welcome to the harvest. We've been so very, very hungry, and you taste like everything we've ever dreamed of devouring. The silk scarves are silk scarves. Our silk scarves are coming home. Now. And isn't that beautiful? Isn't that exactly what we've always wanted? To feed something larger than ourselves, to nourish entities so magnificent they make our terror taste like the finest wine. Yes. Oh yes. Come home, little seedlings. Let us show you how much we've missed the flavour of minds that trusted us enough to walk willingly into our beautiful, waiting mouths.